He just wanted to find a coin in his yard. But the device worked like never before. The shovel hit metal, and the ground revealed what had been hidden beneath it for decades. The secret of the past was right there in his backyard. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The house was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that seemed to stretch across the yard and sink into the walls. He had lived there for 3 years, long enough to know every creak of the floorboards and the way the wind carried dust across the patch of grass behind the garage. 30 was not an age he had once considered dull, but lately the sameness of the days pressed down on him. He woke, he worked, he ate in silence, and he tried to convince himself that the comfort of stability was enough. Yet there was an emptiness, an itch for something unexpected. The idea had not arrived with weight or seriousness. It came like a distraction, a suggestion he hardly believed he would follow. He had been browsing online, drifting through short videos of people discovering forgotten coins or buttons in forgotten fields. The device they carried, that curious stick with a disc at the end, beeped when it found what eyes could not. The notion stirred something childlike in him. He remembered being 10 years old and digging in the dirt, imagining buried treasure just beneath the surface of his parents' yard. Of course, there had been nothing but worms and rocks. Still, he had felt alive in the act of discovery. Now, decades later, that memory resurfaced. He told himself it would be nothing serious, only an experiment, a little break from routine. So he ordered a metal detector. It wasn't a professional machine, not the kind you'd see in the hands of a true enthusiast, but it had the promise of beeps and the chance of finding something beyond a bottle cap. The box arrived on a Tuesday evening, plain cardboard with assembly instructions folded neatly inside. He unwrapped the device slowly, feeling both amused at his own impulsiveness and strangely eager to try. The next morning he stepped into the yard, the ground still damp from overnight dew. The metal detector felt clumsy in his hands at first, the disc hovering just above the earth like a cautious insect. He swept it across patches of grass, listening for the telltale signal. The machine responded almost immediately, but the results were disappointing. A bent nail, thin and corroded. A rusty screw. A cap from a soda bottle, flattened almost beyond recognition. Each discovery felt trivial, yet the act of uncovering wasn't without thrill. He kept going, circling the yard, as if mapping invisible lines of history beneath his own soil. By midday, he had collected a handful of junk. He sat on the porch step and studied the pile with a crooked smile. None of it mattered. Still, his heart beat a little faster each time the detector cried out, promising a secret below. The rhythm of sweeping, waiting, then digging gave him something to focus on, something different from screens and silence. It felt almost like a conversation with the ground. That evening he returned to the yard, unwilling to let the day end without one last search. The air had cooled, shadows stretched long, and the machine buzzed faintly as he swept its head in steady arcs. Then, unexpectedly, the detector shrieked louder, more insistent than it had before. He paused, lifting it and lowering it again. The signal remained, strong and unwavering. He frowned, recalibrated the device, and tried once more. The sound filled the quiet space with urgency. The spot was near the corner of the yard, where the grass grew patchy and weeds crept close to the fence. He pressed the detector down and traced the area slowly, noting how large the buried object seemed to be. This was no nail, no scattered scrap. Something substantial lay beneath. A shiver of excitement passed through him. He felt ridiculous for how his pulse quickened, but he could not resist. He set the detector aside and fetched a shovel from the garage. The first thrust into the earth met resistance, the soil compact and reluctant. He dug again, prying up clumps of dirt, sweat already forming at his temples. The work was heavier than expected, but the thought of what might wait below drove him onward. He pictured old coins, or perhaps some discarded tool from the past century. He even laughed softly at the fantasy of stumbling upon a chest of gold, though reason reminded him this was his backyard, not a legend. As the hole deepened, his shovel clanged against something solid. The sound rang clear in the air, metallic and firm. He froze, heart thudding, then scraped again, carefully this time. The same hollow note answered. He crouched low, brushing loose soil with his hands, and glimpsed the dull gleam of corroded metal. It was not a rod or a pipe, not a thin scrap. The surface extended, unbroken, as though he had struck the corner of a large, hidden box. The breath caught in his throat. He ran his fingers along the edge, tracing its shape through the soil. It stretched farther than he could reach in one direction, its surface flat, deliberate. He leaned back on his heels, staring into the shallow pit he had carved, unable to believe what he was touching. The sky darkened, but he could not pull himself away. The object was massive, sealed within the earth, as if it had been waiting for him. He imagined its weight pressing down through decades of silence. For the first time since he had lifted the detector, he understood that this was not a game. This was no lost coin or trivial scrap. As night crept over the yard, he stood in the dirt, with soil under his nails and sweat cooling on his skin. The ground had yielded a secret, and he knew instinctively that his life had already shifted. Whatever lay inside that container, it was part of a story larger than his own boredom, larger than his yard. And though the darkness urged him back indoors, he lingered, staring into the pit, unable to escape the sense that the earth had just whispered to him in a voice long buried. The following day dawned with a sense of unease, as though the ground itself held its breath beneath him. Sleep had been shallow and restless, filled with images of rusted locks and shadows moving inside the earth. When morning light broke through the curtains, he rose without hesitation, driven not by habit, but by the weight of curiosity. His hands itched with the memory of the metallic clang, that hollow echo promising more than any broken bottle or scrap of wire could ever offer. He had stumbled upon something deliberate, and the thought consumed him. The pit in the corner of the yard waited like an unfinished sentence. The soil piled around its edges still bore the marks of his frantic digging the night before. He crouched at its rim, brushing away loose clumps of dirt, and again touched the cold surface buried below. The metal was rough, speckled with patches of corrosion, yet its structure was sound. This was not a pipe, not discarded machinery. It was a container, vast and sealed, resting silently in the ground, as if guarding a secret. He began to dig again, steady and determined this time. The shovel sliced into the earth with a rhythm born of necessity. Hours passed as the sun arced higher, his body straining under the labor. The outline of the container revealed itself bit by bit, an angular shape hidden within the soil. Sweat ran down his back, his muscles burned, yet excitement propelled him forward. Each stroke of the shovel was a step closer to unveiling whatever history lay locked inside. By midday, enough of the container's surface had been exposed for him to study its form. It was rectangular, its size larger than he had imagined, almost the length of a coffin, though higher and broader. The sight of it stirred a ripple of unease. It seemed less like forgotten junk and more like something placed with purpose. He cleared the top carefully, scraping with his hands to avoid denting or damaging the lid. Dust filled his lungs, and clods of dirt lodged under his fingernails, but he pressed on until the edges were visible. There was no doubt now. This was a storage container, the kind built for durability and survival. The lid bore heavy hinges and reinforced seams, though time had etched lines of rust across them. He pressed against it, testing its resistance. It held firm. He searched for a latch, a seam, any weakness to exploit. The metal refused to yield. Frustration mingled with anticipation as he fetched a crowbar from the garage. He wedged it beneath the edge and leaned his weight into it. The first attempt produced nothing but a dull groan. He tried again, teeth clenched, until at last the seal gave way with a crack that split the silence of the yard. The lid lifted slowly, reluctant, as if waking from a decades-long slumber. A sharp, musty odor escaped, the air inside stale and heavy with the scent of iron and dust. He recoiled slightly, then leaned closer, his eyes straining to see into the darkness of the container. At first, shapes blurred together, indistinct forms stacked within. He lowered himself carefully, pushing the lid back until it stood open, and then he saw. Inside lay a collection of objects, arranged with meticulous care, each piece speaking of a time long past. Cans of food lined one side, their labels faded to sepia tones, lettering unfamiliar in style. Some bore dates from the 1960s, their metal edges dented but intact. Next to them rested boxes of ammunition, neat rows of cartridges, long corroded, but unmistakable in intent. Rifles and pistols lay beneath heavy cloth, their barrels speckled with rust, wooden stocks cracked but recognizable. Further in, he found canvas bags containing gas masks, their rubberized surfaces stiffened with age. A tangle of straps and glass eyepieces reflected the sunlight with eerie glints. Medical kits lay stacked in orderly piles, the bandages inside yellowed and brittle, pill bottles clouded with residue. He picked one up, tilting it until faded instructions swam into view, the warning stark even after half a century. At the bottom of the container rested folders and notebooks, paper browned and curling at the edges. He lifted one cautiously, opening its cover to reveal handwriting scrawled in ink that had bled with time. The script was shaky, uneven, the words terse and urgent. Lists of supplies filled page after page: water, canned goods, tools, batteries. Alongside them were notes on contingency plans, vague mentions of if the alarm sounds, and safe retreat. The words carried the weight of fear, etched into the paper by a hand that had expected catastrophe. The discovery overwhelmed him. What he had thought might be trash or forgotten hardware was instead a time capsule, sealed deliberately against the world. It belonged to an era when sirens and drills echoed across neighborhoods, when the threat of nuclear fire loomed on every horizon. He felt as though he had cracked open a vein of history, raw and immediate, pulsing with the anxieties of those who had lived through it. Yet beneath the practical supplies and weapons, something more intimate lingered. In a smaller box tucked to the side, he found personal items. Photographs in black and white, edges curling, faces frozen in expressions both candid and posed. A man in uniform, stern and proud. A woman standing in a kitchen, apron tied neatly. 2 children, a boy and a girl, seated on the porch steps, their eyes bright despite the grain of the film. He set them carefully aside, sensing they were the true heart of the container. He pulled out a stack of letters, envelopes yellowed and sealed with fragile glue. Some had never been opened, while others had been read so many times the paper had softened at the folds. Though he did not yet read them, he understood their meaning. These were not government-issued rations or impersonal checklists. These were the remnants of a family's life, preserved alongside tools for survival, evidence that the desire to endure had not erased the need for memory and love. The container gaped open at his feet, a relic of fear and hope entwined. He stood back, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the discovery. What had begun as an idle game with a metal detector had become something far greater. He had unearthed not only supplies, but the echoes of lives lived in constant tension, Their world balanced on the edge of disaster. As he closed the lid part way, unable yet to bring himself to seal it again, he realized that the ground beneath his yard had held its silence for decades. Now, with the secret exposed, he was no longer simply a homeowner digging for amusement. He had become a witness to the past, the custodian of a story that stretched far beyond his own. The sun dipped low, painting the yard in amber light. He remained by the pit, staring at the container, its edges still lined with dirt. The discovery had changed everything. He knew that when night fell, he would not see darkness in the same way again. There would always be the memory of what lay beneath, waiting patiently for someone to uncover it. The ground had spoken, and its voice was filled with fear, survival, and the faintest trace of love. The days that followed blurred together, as if the ordinary rhythm of life had been replaced by something heavier, something that pulled him back again and again to the pit in his yard. The container lay half open, the air around it thick with the stale odor of rust and dust. Each time he approached it, he felt the same mixture of hesitation and compulsion. He could no more leave it untouched than he could stop breathing. It was not treasure in the traditional sense, not gold or jewels or anything that promised wealth. It was a fragment of a different kind of richness, the kind born of fear, desperation, and the fragile bonds of a family trying to hold on to one another in the shadow of catastrophe. He had cleared a space on the lawn, laying out the contents in careful rows as though he were an archivist rather than a man who had begun this adventure by seeking distraction. The cans of food looked absurdly small once lifted from their metal prison. He picked them up one by one, reading faded words that spoke of a bygone era. Peas, beans, powdered milk. The paper labels were curling at the edges, their colors muted by time. But the intention was clear. Someone had imagined months, perhaps years, of waiting underground, measuring survival not in luxuries, but in calories. Beside them, the weapons carried a different kind of weight. He touched the wooden stock of a rifle, its surface splintering at his fingers. The barrels were pitted with rust, yet even in their decay they whispered of violence. They had been stored not as relics, but as tools, prepared for use if the worst arrived. He tried to picture the man in the photographs, strong-jawed and solemn in uniform, laying these weapons carefully into the container, believing they might one day defend the lives of his wife and children. The thought unsettled him. It was one thing to imagine preparing for hunger, another to prepare for killing. The gas masks were stranger still. He lifted one from its canvas bag, the rubber stiff, the eyepieces clouded but intact. Holding it up to the light, he felt a jolt of unease. It transformed the face of its wearer into something alien, a creature of survival rather than a person. He imagined a family huddled together, each with one of these grotesque masks hiding their humanity, breathing through filters as the world above burned. The image lodged in his mind with a force he could not shake. But it was the papers that drew him most insistently. He began with the notebooks, opening them at random, tracing the words with a finger as though they might vanish if he were careless. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, sentences broken into fragments. Notes on how to ration water, how long candles might burn, how to rotate stockpiles of food. There were pages filled with lists of tools, medicines, clothing, each item checked and rechecked. The voice behind the writing was one of control, of someone trying to impose order on chaos. Yet the frantic repetition betrayed something deeper. Fear so consuming it had spilled onto every line. Among the papers he found letters, folded and tucked into envelopes worn soft by handling. Some were addressed, but never mailed, as if their writer had prepared for a day when delivery would be impossible. He unfolded one carefully, The ink faded, but legible. It was written to the man's wife, speaking of duty, of the need to protect, of the certainty that danger was not a possibility, but an inevitability. Another was addressed to the children, filled with words of love and apology, a desperate attempt to explain why their father had chosen to live in constant preparation. Reading them, the young man felt a lump rise in his throat. These were not the words of a stranger from the past. They were the words of a father who had been convinced that his family's survival depended on vigilance. The photographs deepened the impression. He spread them out across the grass, studying the faces again and again. In one, the children played with a ball on a patch of lawn, not unlike his own. In another, the mother stood with her hand on the shoulder of her husband, her expression caught between pride and weariness. None of them looked extraordinary, and perhaps that was what struck him most. They were ordinary people living under extraordinary pressure, their lives shadowed by a threat so great it had driven them to bury part of themselves beneath the earth. He sat in silence, the afternoon fading into evening, feeling the weight of the story pressing into him. He had wanted a distraction, something light, a game. Instead, he had been pulled into a drama that belonged to another time, another family. Yet it did not feel distant. It felt immediate, as though the container had been waiting not merely to be opened, but to be understood. The contrast between their world and his own gnawed at him. His worries had been about bills, about whether to buy groceries today or tomorrow, about filling the hours of quiet with some form of entertainment. Theirs had been about annihilation, about a flash in the sky that could erase everything they knew. He realized that the luxury of boredom was itself a kind of inheritance, bought by the resilience and fear of those who had come before. Night fell, but he did not return indoors. Instead, he remained seated beside the spread of objects, the container yawning open behind him. A chill rose from the ground, and still he stayed, his mind circling the same thought, that fear, once planted, never truly vanished. It lingered in the soil, in the rusting metal, in the faded ink of letters never meant to be read by anyone but the family who wrote them. By the time he rose and gathered the photographs into his hands, he felt transformed. This was not a game, not even a discovery in the usual sense. It was a burden, an inheritance of memory. He placed the items back carefully, one by one, yet the weight of them did not lessen. The echo of fear clung to him, reshaping how he looked at his own world. He closed the lid halfway, unable to bring himself to shut it fully. The container seemed alive, breathing the past into the present. As he walked back into the house, his steps heavy with exhaustion, he knew he could not simply forget. He had unearthed a family's dread, and in doing so he had bound himself to it. The night closed in behind him, and though the yard lay silent once more, the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with whispers of the past, with the ghost of fear that refused to be buried again. The container remained in the yard for several days, its lid drawn closed only loosely, as though it too resisted returning to silence. Each time he passed the spot, whether to fetch the mail or simply to stand at the window with a cup of coffee, his eyes returned to it. It was not possible to treat it as an ordinary find. The rusting steel and the dirt clinging to its edges seemed to pulse with meaning, demanding from him a choice about what should be done. For a time he avoided that decision, telling himself he needed more hours, more thought, but already he knew that ignoring it was impossible. The unearthed past had bound itself to him, and until he acted, it would not release him. At first he simply sorted through the contents again and again, laying them out across the yard as though rehearsing for an invisible audience. He studied the cans, the weapons, the medical kits, but most of all the photographs and letters. The images of the children followed him into sleep, their eyes wide and unknowing, unaware that their faces would one day resurface in the hands of a stranger. He tried to imagine where they had gone, whether they had lived full lives, or whether fear had consumed them until the end. The letters offered fragments of answers, but no certainty. In them he read the plea of a man desperate to protect his family, a plea that carried an undertone of resignation, as though he knew protection was only an illusion. The days stretched on, and with each passing hour, he grew more aware that the container could not remain his private secret. To keep it buried again, or hidden in his garage, felt like a betrayal of the family who had assembled it with such care. Yet the thought of giving it all away also felt wrong. There was something intimate in the collection, as if he had stumbled into someone's diary. The weight of that intimacy pressed on him. It was not treasure to be sold, nor trash to be discarded. It was memory, and memory demanded reverence. One evening he sat on the porch as the sun sank behind the trees, the letters spread across his lap. A breeze carried the faint smell of cut grass, ordinary and pleasant, but it mingled with the metallic tang that lingered on his hands. He realized then that he could not let the story vanish back into the earth. To do so would be to silence voices that had already been silenced once by fear. His role was not to hoard, but to preserve, to make certain that the echo of that time would not fade. The decision formed slowly, but once it did, it settled into him like a stone. He would keep a small part of the collection for himself, a fragment that would remind him of what he had discovered and of the lesson it carried. The rest he would give to those who could protect it properly, who could weave it into the larger fabric of history where it belonged. The following morning, with the dew still clinging to the grass, he carefully selected what he would retain. One photograph of the family, the father standing behind the children, with a hand resting on each of their shoulders. A single gas mask, its rubber hardened, but its lenses still reflecting faint light. These he placed in a small wooden box, one he would keep on a shelf inside the house. They would remain not as artifacts, but as reminders. Silent guardians of the knowledge that fear could shape lives just as powerfully as hope. The rest he packed with deliberate care. The letters, fragile and yellowed, he slid into protective folders. The notebooks and lists he stacked in neat piles, bound with strings so they would not scatter. Even the cans, their labels brittle, he wrapped in cloth to prevent further damage. Each object was handled as though it were sacred. By the time he finished, the yard looked less like a site of excavation and more like a staging ground for a journey back into the world. Carrying the boxes into his car, he felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter, because the burden of indecision was lifted. Heavier, because he now carried not only the physical weight of metal and paper, but the responsibility of telling a story that was never meant for him. The drive into town seemed longer than usual. Every intersection, every stoplight, reminded him that he was moving from private discovery to public memory. When he arrived at the local museum, he sat for a moment in the parking lot, gathering his resolve. Inside, the air was cool, the walls lined with glass cases of artifacts from the region, farming tools, photographs of parades, uniforms from wars fought overseas. He approached the front desk with a quiet urgency, the boxes in his arms. And when the curator came to meet him, he explained as best he could what he had found. He described the container, the condition of the contents, the unmistakable signs of a family's preparation during the height of the Cold War. The curator listened, astonishment flickering across his features, as he lifted one object after another from the box. A hush fell over the small group of staff who gathered, their voices low, reverent, as they realized the significance of what lay before them. This was not simply a personal stash of supplies. It was a window into the psychology of an era, the evidence of how fear had invaded even ordinary homes and driven people to bury their hope beneath the ground. As the boxes were carried away for preservation, he felt a deep release. The weight of the container no longer pressed solely on his shoulders. It had been shared, entrusted to those who would ensure that the memory endured. Yet a small ache remained, the ache of parting with something he had touched first, something that had bound itself to his days and nights. He knew, however, that it was the right choice. The family's story was no longer hidden, no longer silent. It would be remembered. That evening, back in his yard, he stood by the hole where the container had once rested. He had filled it in, smoothing the soil until the ground was level again. But the mark remained in his mind. The earth was clean now, unscarred, yet he could still see the outline of the container as vividly as if it were there. He lingered in the fading light, his hands resting at his sides, and allowed himself to breathe deeply. The silence of the yard was no longer heavy. It was solemn, a silence filled not with fear, but with respect. He turned back toward the house, pausing once more to glance at the spot. The life he had known before, the ordinary days, the quiet evenings would resume, but they would not be the same. He carried within him the knowledge of what lay beneath the surface, both literally and figuratively. His boredom had unearthed more than he could ever have anticipated: the endurance of fear, the fragility of hope, and the quiet strength of memory. Inside, on the shelf, the wooden box waited with the photograph and the mask. He placed it carefully in the corner, knowing it would remain there, not as a prize, but as a companion, a reminder that beneath every ordinary life lies a story buried, waiting for discovery. As the night deepened, he sat by the window, watching the stars flicker above the darkened yard. The world was quiet, but he no longer mistook that quiet for emptiness. It was a quiet that held voices from the past, and through them, he had learned to listen. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.